On a frozen Christmas night, when the world seemed buried in silence, a lone police officer drove through a mountain town, swallowed by snow, believing the road ahead was empty and the night was ordinary, until a single quiet knock changed everything. What stood outside his patrol car was not a person, but a wounded white German shepherd with fear in its eyes and a message too urgent for words. That knock would lead him into a secret hidden beneath the snow, a secret that would test courage, faith, and the meaning of mercy. Before this story begins, tell us where you are watching from, and leave your city or country in the comments. And if you believe that quiet miracles still happen in this world, please press subscribe to support this channel, so we can continue bringing these stories of hope to you. On the night of December 24th, Pine Haven disappeared beneath snow, so thick it seemed the town had been erased and rewritten in white, its narrow streets swallowed by silence, its dim porch lights trembling like small, tired stars beneath the storm. This was a mountain city built on timber, old rail lines, and stubborn hearts. A place where winter was not a season, but a force that shaped every life, every loss, and every quiet miracle that dared to survive the cold. Officer Ethan Cole drove alone through that erased world, his patrol car moving slowly, as if afraid to disturb what the storm was building, the windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the spiraling frost. Ethan was 36 years old, tall but slightly stooped in the shoulders from years of service, and a weight that had nothing to do with the badge, his face cut with the quiet symmetry of a man who had once smiled easily and now rationed it like a scarce resource. His dark hair always a little too long at the edges, as if he no longer cared much for mirrors, his eyes a muted gray that carried both alertness and an old, unspoken weariness. He was known in Pine Haven as steady, reliable, gentle with children and animals, distant with adults, and painfully precise in his work. A few winters earlier, a rescue had gone wrong. A fellow K-9 partner named Rex had died beneath an avalanche, and though no report ever blamed Ethan, something inside him had folded inward since that night, shaping his calm into something sharper, more guarded, like ice over deep water. Christmas Eve was supposed to mean warmth, family, laughter, but for Ethan, it meant the final shift before a quiet holiday in an empty house, a ritual of motion to avoid stillness. And as the blizzard clawed at the patrol car, he whispered a brief habit of words learned long ago in the academy, not as prayer exactly, but as a way to keep fear from talking too loudly. Then came the knock. It was not the sound of wind-thrown debris or the brittle slap of ice against glass, but a soft, deliberate tap against the driver's side window. So intimate it startled him into full awareness. Ethan's hand tightened instinctively around the steering wheel before he turned his head, expecting perhaps a stranded motorist or a desperate pedestrian lost in the storm. But what stood there was neither human nor illusion. A white German shepherd, large and powerfully built, beneath a coat dulled by grime and snow, its body marked with shallow cuts along the flank, as if it had forced its way through something sharp. One hind leg barely touching the ground as it trembled from cold and pain. The dog's fur was the color of clean bone beneath moonlight, rare for the breed, making it appear almost spectral against the storm. Its ears stood upright, though one bore a small tear near the tip, its muzzle dusted with frost, and its eyes were pale amber, not wild, not pleading, but burning with a lucid urgency that unsettled Ethan more than any frantic bark might have done. The dog did not bark, it did not whine. It simply looked at him, then turned its head toward the darkness behind it, took 3 careful steps away, stopped, and looked back again. This was no beggar's gesture. It was command layered with desperation, a silent order pressed through pain and will. Ethan exhaled sharply, radioed dispatch with steady professionalism to request permission to leave the vehicle for no more than 500 meters. His voice controlled, even as something ancient stirred in his chest, that long-buried instinct that once bound him to a fallen K-9 partner and never quite released him. Approval came through with static and caution. He pulled on his thermal jacket, the fabric stiff with cold, opened the door, and the storm bit into him like a living thing. The dog did not retreat. It watched. Ethan crouched slowly, speaking in low tones, meant more for himself than for the animal, noting the shallow breathing, the fatigue in the tremor of the injured leg. the restraint in its eyes that suggested training, or at least disciplined survival. He lifted the dog with careful effort, its weight surprising, solid, and placed it into the back seat of the patrol car, where the heat immediately stirred the frost from its fur into drifting vapor. For a few minutes, the dog allowed this mercy without resistance, its chest rising and falling in steadier rhythm, its gaze fixed not on Ethan, but on the vague suggestion of forest beyond the blurred windows. Ethan studied it through the rearview mirror with the professional attention he once gave to partner dogs. The healthy slope of the skull, the strength in the shoulders even now, the endurance written into the breadth of its rib cage. This was no stray. This was a survivor. The cuts along its body were not deep enough to be mortal, but were too patterned to be accidental. And beneath the scent of wet fur lingered something bitter and unnatural that did not belong to snow or forest. When the dog shifted and attempted to stand despite the pain, Ethan opened the door again. It leapt down of its own will, landing lightly on the injured leg as if refusing to acknowledge what it could not afford to feel. Snow swallowed the prints almost as soon as they formed. The dog began to move, slow but unwavering, and Ethan followed, leaving the warmth of the patrol car behind, as one leaves the known world for a map that exists only in faith. The city of Pinehaven faded within minutes into shadow and drifting white as the road narrowed and the trees drew close, their branches heavy with winter's burden, like bowed witnesses to a story none of them would later speak. The dog never once looked back again now that Ethan had committed. It moved with intention through terrain that defied human navigation, favoring paths that no marked trail acknowledged, as if guided by memory rather than sight. Ethan felt the strange reversal of roles settle into him, the wounded leading the able, the silent giving direction to the sworn protector. Snow gathered in the folds of his uniform, melted and refroze at the edges of his gloves, and yet beneath the bite of cold, something warmer awakened, an old, guarded readiness that had once belonged to partnership, to trust carried not in words, but in shared breath and motion. Behind them, Pinehaven receded like a dream one forgets upon waking, and ahead, the forest thickened into a corridor of shadow and falling white. The dog's breath steamed faintly in the beam of Ethan's flashlight, each step a defiance of both pain and uncertainty. And as they crossed the invisible boundary where roads surrendered to raw wilderness, Ethan realized with a quiet, unsettling certainty that whatever waited at the end of this unmarked journey would not be found on any map drawn by human hands. Without a sound, the white shepherd led him deeper into the storm. The forest began where Pinehaven ended, not with a clear boundary, but with a slow erasure of certainty. The last streetlight dissolved behind them like a fading memory, and the white German shepherd stepped forward into terrain that belonged more to instinct than to roads. Snow deepened with every yard, swallowing sound, softening the world into a breathless hush where even the storm seemed to lower its voice. Ethan moved behind the dog with deliberate care, boots sinking into powder that reached mid-calf, his flashlight sweeping shallow arcs across trunks bent under the burden of winter. The dog, later to be known as Halo, though Ethan had not yet named it, advanced with an economy of motion that betrayed training or a will carved by repeated survival. Its injured hind leg dragged faintly at times, leaving a distorted line among the clean prints, yet it never slowed beyond what endurance demanded. Up close, the dog's age revealed itself more clearly, perhaps 3 years old, fully grown, muscles taut beneath the pale coat, still young enough that pain had not taught resignation. Its ears caught every tremor of sound, and its breath misted in steady, controlled bursts, as if it rationed even the act of breathing. Ethan noted the details unconsciously, the same way one catalogues evidence without yet knowing the crime. The deeper they went, the stranger the path became, sloping into territory where no official trail marker had stood for decades, if ever. A hunting exclusion zone, known among locals as a place where compasses lied and radios went mute. The first sign came as a streak across the snow that cut unnaturally straight through drifting chaos. A drag mark, faint but unmistakable, as if something heavy had been pulled unwillingly downhill. Ethan knelt, brushing away loose crystals with gloved fingers, his pulse tightening as the smooth underlayer revealed itself like a scar beneath flesh. The dog paused ahead, watching him not with impatience but with an unsettling calm, as though it already knew what he would find. and accepted the delay as necessary. A few minutes later, farther along the same line, Ethan's flashlight caught the dull gleam of plastic half entombed in ice. He chipped it free with the edge of his boot heel and lifted it into the beam. A syringe, its barrel clouded with frozen residue, needle sheathed in brittle frost. The smell reached him an instant later, faint but acrid, chemical and wrong against the clean austerity of the forest. His jaw tightened. This was no accident, no injured animal wandering blindly into town. Whatever story had begun here was still unfolding, and the dog beside him was not fleeing it, but retracing its spine. As they continued upward, the slope sharpened without warning, the ground beneath the powder revealing its treachery too late. Ethan's foot slid on a hidden crust of ice. His balance shattered in one silent instant, and his body pitched sideways toward a drop concealed by drifting snow. The reflex to brace was cut short by sudden impact, not against stone or trunk, but against warm, living mass. The dog had thrown itself into his fall, its shoulder striking his thigh, deflecting his momentum just enough for him to collapse backward instead of sideways. Pain flared briefly in its injured leg as it landed, yet it did not cry out. Ethan sprawled in the snow, heart racing, staring for a breathless moment at the falling sky, then scrambled upright with a muttered oath and dropped to his knees beside the dog. He checked the leg quickly, fingers moving with practiced restraint, murmuring low reassurance more to steady his own nerves than the animal's. The dog endured the contact without flinching, eyes fixed on his face as if gauging not tenderness, but resolve. The moment passed, it rose again and moved on. In that exchange, brief as a heartbeat, a strange understanding settled between them. Neither could afford to turn back. The forest deepened into a cathedral of shadow and snow-laden limbs, the wind threading through branches in low, distant moans that sounded less like weather and more like memory. Time stretched strangely in that enclosed world. Ethan could not have said whether minutes or lifetimes slid by between one breath and the next. His radio crackled once with static and died again, leaving only the steady rhythm of his own steps and the dog's uneven but relentless advance. 40 minutes after leaving the last trace of Pine Haven behind, the ground dipped unexpectedly, opening into a hollow so perfectly hidden that the storm itself seemed to have conspired in its secrecy. There, crouched against the slope like a thing ashamed of its own existence, stood a cabin of unpainted timber, roof bowed beneath years of accumulated snow, windows black and blind. No smoke rose. No tracks marked the approach, except those they themselves had made. To most eyes it would have been dismissed as an abandoned hunting shack, another forgotten structure swallowed by wilderness. But every instinct Ethan possessed tightened at the sight of it. The dog slowed, not from fatigue now, but from something heavier, its tail lowering, ears angling back a few degrees, as it approached the structure it seemed to know too well. Snow whispered against wood as the wind shifted. Ethan halted 10 meters away, scanning the perimeter, his breathing loud in his own ears. There was no sound of movement within, yet the stillness felt deliberate, held, as if something inside waited not in ignorance, but in restraint. He glanced at the dog. Its gaze did not seek his this time. It was fixed on the dark shape of the cabin, with a focus so intense it bordered on reverence or dread. Ethan understood then that the road they had taken was not merely one of distance, but of return. Whatever wound had driven this animal through blizzard and pain to find him, it had not been inflicted at random. The forest had not led them astray. The forest had been led by the dog. Snow gathered in the folds of Ethan's jacket as he radioed again, voice low, clipped, and increasingly aware of how alone they were beyond the reach of immediate aid. Static answered him, like distant surf. He cut the transmission and shifted his grip on the flashlight, its beam trembling once as his breath caught in the cold. He did not draw his weapon yet. Something in the air demanded patience over force. The dog took 3 more steps forward and stopped. Its entire body stilled, as if balanced upon an invisible line that could not be crossed without consequence. Ethan stepped up beside it, shoulder to shoulder, with a creature that hours earlier had been a stranger at his window and now stood as his guide into something undefined and formidable. The storm pressed closer around the hollow, muffling the wider world, Isolating cabin, man, and animal within a circle of snow and silence that felt older than law, older than even fear. Whatever lay beyond that door, it had not called for help with a voice. It had sent a wounded messenger instead. The cabin did not welcome intrusion the way abandoned places sometimes do, with loose hinges and crumbling frames that almost invite discovery. Instead, it stood sealed in a stubborn silence, its door thick with reinforced timber, its windows darkened not merely by age but by deliberate treatment, the glass coated from the inside to reject both reflection and curiosity. Ethan remained still for several seconds after reaching the perimeter, letting his breathing settle into quiet control, the cold scraping his lungs with every measured inhale. The white German shepherd stood beside him, head low now, body tense in a way that spoke not of aggression but of memory, awakened against its will. Snow gathered soundlessly on the dog's back, clinging to the pale fur like ash on fresh bone. Ethan raised his radio and transmitted again with precise restraint, reporting location, cabin discovery, suspicious evidence along the approach, and loss of signal reliability. Static swallowed most of the message, leaving only fragments that vanished into the storm. He waited the full 10 minutes he had been trained to allow under compromised conditions, counting heartbeats rather than seconds, eyes shifting repeatedly between the darkened windows and the tree line behind them. No response came. The storm did not ease. The forest did not answer. Only the dog stirred, shifting its weight with a faint hiss of pain from the injured leg. That sound made the decision for him. Ethan advanced to the door and tested the handle. Locked. He circled once, checking for structural weakness, finding none, noting how deliberately the cabin had been constructed to resist both weather and intrusion. The smell returned more strongly here, sharp and medicinal beneath the cold resin of pine, a scent that did not belong to hunting lodges or forgotten hikers. He forced entry through a narrow service panel hidden beneath a bank of snow, splintering aged bolts with the controlled violence of a trained strike. The door gave with a dull crack that sounded far too loud in the cavern of whiteness outside. Inside, the air was stale and unnaturally still, as if the cabin itself had been holding its breath since the last human presence withdrew. Ethan swept the flashlight beam in wide, careful arcs, revealing not the expected debris of abandonment, but a space stripped of comfort and purpose alike. A single metal table bolted to the floor, its surface scratched and pitted by repeated use. A set of insulated containers against the far wall marked with fading chemical labels, and along the wooden planks beneath them, dark streaks dragged into permanent memory. The dog crossed the threshold without hesitation, and then slowed, its earlier determination folding into tremor as something inside this place reached back through time and seized it. Ethan followed, boots scraping softly against the floorboards, the beam of his light shuddering slightly as he tracked the lines of the room. There were no beds, no cooking tools, no signs of habitation in the human sense, only function reduced to its coldest components. The metal containers were sealed. Frost had formed around their rims from the unnatural chill within. Ethan did not open them yet, his attention fixed instead on the drag marks that led toward the rear of the cabin, their direction too consistent to be accidental, converging toward what appeared to be nothing more than a blank wooden wall. The dog approached that wall as if drawn by magnetism, its paws leaving faint crescents in the dust, its breath quickening. When its nose brushed the timber, its entire body shuddered as though touched by an electrical current. Ethan tapped the surface with his knuckles, hollow. He struck again with more force. The sound returned, wrong in a way that no illusion could mask. He pressed his shoulder into the panel and drove forward with controlled weight. The wood resisted for a breath, and then gave way, the hidden structure behind it collapsing inward with a rush of cold air that tasted of iron and antiseptic. The beam of his flashlight punched through the opening and into a space that had no right to exist beneath an isolated mountain cabin. The room beyond was carved into the earth itself, a sublevel constructed with poured concrete and reinforced steel, cables and pipes running across the ceiling like exposed veins. The temperature dropped sharply as he entered, breath fogging thickly before his face. What the light revealed silenced even the storm in his mind. A row of iron cages lined the walls, their bars thick, the locking mechanisms industrial rather than domestic. Inside each, a living shape curled or sagged in varied degrees of collapse. A raccoon with unnaturally pale fur lay on its side, sides heaving shallowly, dark eyes rimmed with dull redness. Two rabbits huddled together in the next enclosure, ears pressed back, twitching faintly with each uneven breath. A snowy owl lay slumped beneath clipped wings, head drooping as if even the instinct to remain upright had been chemically suppressed. Farther along, a wolf pup scarcely past infancy trembled weakly against the bars, ribs visible beneath dirty gray fur. A wildcat crouched near motionlessness in shadow, chest rising with rigid effort. The final cage held a skunk, its striped body limp. The defensive power for which it was built reduced to nothing but a scent lingering uselessly in cold air. All were alive. All were failing. Ethan moved forward slowly, the beam of his light sliding from one captive to the next, with the careful horror of a man counting bodies after disaster. Every sign spoke of systematic experimentation rather than neglect. IV lines still taped to fur in places, shaved patches on limbs and necks, faint burns where electrodes had kissed skin. The raccoon lifted its head weakly at the sound of his approach and released a thin, confused chitter that barely echoed. Ethan swallowed hard, the professional shield around his, heart cracking under the weight of what he saw. This was no poacher's den. This was a laboratory without papers, a science stripped of ethics and buried beneath snow. The dog had followed him into the chamber, but halted abruptly near the final cage. Its trembling intensified, breath hitching, its gaze not wandering across the other animals, but locked onto an emptiness between two enclosures where a sixth cage stood warped and ruined. The bars of that cage were bent outward, not violently shattered, but forced with repeated pressure applied from within rather than without. The floor before it bore shallow grooves etched by nails or claws, desperate marks that told a long story in short, merciless lines. The dog stepped closer, ignoring the protest of its injured leg, and lowered itself into a seated position directly before the empty space. It did not whine, it did not howl. It simply sat, rigid and silent, head bowed slightly, as if in acknowledgement of a past self that had once occupied that prison and had somehow refused to remain. Ethan's breath left him in a slow, broken exhale. The truth unfolded without words. This animal had not discovered this place by chance. It had been forged here. The cuts along its flank, the tear in its ear, the strange discipline in its movements, all converged into a single revelation that struck with the quiet force of inevitability. The dog had escaped, and now, rather than running forever from what had broken it, it had returned to drag the rest of the forgotten out of darkness. Ethan knelt beside the empty cage, the cold seeping through the fabric of his uniform into bone, his hand hovering uncertainly above the scarred floor. He did not touch the dog yet. Some reverences demanded distance. He scanned the chamber again with fresh understanding, reading the silent clues with sharpened perception, the sequence of cages suggesting controlled variables, the absence of identification tags to shield culpability, the calculated isolation of species rarely seen together in nature. This was not cruelty born of impulse. This was intention sharpened into procedure. The dog shifted slightly beside him, its breath catching as the memories pressed closer than it could push them away. Ethan turned his head slowly and met its eyes. In that moment, the animal did not look like a victim rescued by coincidence. It looked like a witness who had chosen to testify. Above them, the cabin creaked faintly as wind tested its seams, snow drifting across the hidden doorway, as if the storm itself wished to conceal the evidence once more. Ethan rose, every muscle heavy with the knowledge that discovery had already changed the nature of his night and his life. He reached out at last and placed his gloved hand carefully upon the dog's head. The fur beneath his palm was warm despite the cold. The dog did not pull away. It leaned in by a fraction, the smallest surrender of weight, enough to confirm that the return had not been mistaken. Whatever had been taken from it in this place, something essential had survived long enough to bring him here. The storm did not pause for discovery. It pressed harder against the hidden cabin, as if angered by exposure, thick curtains of snow collapsing inward from the dark sky, sealing the hollow once more in white anonymity. Ethan moved fast now, urgency replacing the stunned stillness that had followed the revelation beneath the cabin. He transmitted coordinates again and again through the failing radio, switching frequencies, repeating the same message with tightening clarity. Multiple live animals in critical condition, underground confinement, hazardous materials present, officer on site with injured civilian animal. Static chewed through most of his words, but this time, faintly, a fragment of acknowledgement surfaced before vanishing again. It was enough to tell him the signal had reached someone, somewhere. The waiting, however, would be long. The terrain, the storm, and the isolation all conspired against time. 70 minutes, dispatch would later tell him. 70 minutes between survival and silence. Ethan removed his outer gloves and used the inner thermal liners to stabilize the weakest animals as best he could, without disturbing the restraints that still tethered them to tubing and lines he dared not fully disconnect. He spoke softly to each of them, not with promises he could not guarantee, but with steady sound meant to tether fading awareness to the present. The raccoon's breathing shuddered and steadied when his voice reached it. The owl's rigid form eased by a fraction as warmth from a portable heat pack touched beneath its folded wings. The wolf pup let out a thin sound that might once have been a growl and curled tighter against the bars. The dog remained near the broken cage, watching it all with unwavering intensity, standing despite the tremor in its injured leg, as if leaving this room even briefly would unmake its purpose. Above them, the storm battered the cabin roof like an impatient tide. Ethan retreated to the surface level to prepare the extraction point, carving a clearer path from door to hollow with his shovel and boots, widening what the storm kept narrowing. His breath plumed thickly in the floodlight he mounted against the doorframe, casting a single golden pillar into the darkness. Time stretched with merciless elasticity. Every minute throbbed with consequence. He returned below every few minutes to reassess vitals by sight and sound alone, measuring survival in tremors and the fragile rise of chests. At some point, the skunk convulsed once and then went still, the faint rasp of its breathing silencing as gently as a candle wick touched by cold air. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second beside the cage, bowed his head in wordless acknowledgement, then forced himself onward. There was no room here for grief that lingered. By the time distant engine sounds finally cut through the storm, like an answer to a long-forgotten prayer, 2 of the animals had slipped into critical collapse, their pulses too faint to discern without equipment that had yet to arrive. The sound grew closer, mechanical and determined, engines grinding against snow and gravity. Blue and red lights fractured the hollow into violent color, turning drifting snow into a storm of shattered sapphires and bleeding rubies. Rescue units emerged like armored figures from myth, faces wrapped, movements purposeful and fast, despite the treacherous footing. Medics descended first, their breath steaming behind clear shields, followed by wildlife officers and hazardous materials specialists, whose reflective stripes caught and multiplied the emergency lights into blinding constellations. Ethan briefed them with clipped efficiency as they worked, words stripped of emotion by necessity. Beneath the cabin, heaters roared to life, thick cords snaking down into the frozen chamber as warmth began clawing its way into the underground cold. One by one, the cages were opened. The raccoon was lifted out on a makeshift insulated stretcher, its small body wrapped in foil-lined blankets as oxygen flowed through a miniature mask designed for impossibly small lungs. The rabbits were transferred together, still pressed close, their ears trembling weakly as warmth reached bone. The owl was freed with surgical care, talons carefully restrained even in its near-unconscious state, as if instinct alone might yet lash out in confused defense. The wolf pup was last, its tiny body shivering violently as circulation struggled to return, its eyes fluttering without focus. 2 of the animals coded briefly during the transfer, their fragile systems overwhelmed by the sudden change between cold stasis and invasive life. Medics fought for them with astonishing tenderness, hands moving with a precision that felt almost reverent, warming blood, stimulating breath, coaxing life back into spaces determined to surrender it. One returned, one did not. The forest received the second death in silence, as if unwilling to echo the loss. Through all of it, the white German shepherd did not sit. It did not pace. It stood rigid beside the empty cage that had once held it, eyes tracking each movement, each removal, each narrow victory and irreversible failure. Snow settled across its back in slow accumulation, melting and refreezing in fragile crystals along its spine. Its injured leg shook from fatigue now, rather than pain alone, yet it refused to lower itself. Ethan moved to its side when the last cage was finally opened and the surviving animals loaded for transport. The underground chamber reduced at last to an empty vault, stripped of both its victims and its power. He rested his gloved hand gently against the dog's neck, feeling the pulse there beneath cold fur and hardened muscle. "This Christmas," he said quietly, voice nearly lost beneath engines and wind, "you saved more lives than an entire police unit." The words were not for recognition. They were for witness. The dog did not understand language as men shaped it, but it understood tone, stillness, and release. Its body softened subtly beneath his touch, weight shifting at last, as if some internal vigil had been completed. In the far distance, faint and thin as memory, the sound of church bells drifted through the storm from Pine Haven below, their notes stretched and distorted by wind and space, yet unmistakably human. Each strike seemed to land gently against the night, threading sacred order through chaos. As the last transport vehicle disappeared into the blizzard with its fragile cargo of fur and breath, the hollow fell quiet again, the emergency lights dimming one by one until only Ethan, the dog, and the sleeping cabin remained beneath the falling snow. Christmas had arrived without warmth, without carols, without crowds. It had arrived with trembling hands in the cold, with lives unwrapped from iron, and with a white figure that had once been a prisoner and now stood, finally, as something else entirely. The days after Christmas did not feel like days so much as a single, drawn-out breath that no one in Pine Haven fully released. The storm slowly loosened its grip on the mountains, but the town moved through a different kind of weather now, one made of rumors, fragments of information, and the uneasy knowledge that something monstrous had been hiding just above them in the snow. For Officer Ethan Cole, time became a measured sequence of reports, interviews, and silent drives between the station, the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, and the evidence lab 2 counties away. Halo, as the white German Shepherd had finally been named in the paperwork and among the rescue team, spent those first days under observation, isolated, monitored, stitched, and tested. Ethan visited when his schedule allowed, standing by the reinforced kennel door, while Halo regarded him with that same steady, searching gaze, no longer frantic, no longer trapped, but not yet free of the echoes etched into his nerves. The investigation itself unfolded in layers. Chemical analysis came back first, days after the raid on the cabin, delivered by a lab technician with tired eyes and a voice flattened by overexposure to bad news. In a fluorescent-lit room that smelled faintly of coffee and antiseptic, Ethan sat beside the lead investigator and listened as the technician explained the compounds. Experimental sedatives, illegal variants of tranquilizers, traces of substances designed to alter neurological responses in animals, their dosages calculated not for treatment, but for control. The technician, a woman in her late 30s named Mariah Geller, short, compact, with tightly curled dark hair pulled into a bun and a demeanor built from equal parts exhaustion and stubborn belief in data, pushed a stack of printouts across the table. Her manner was clinical, but her hands lingered a moment on the pages as if unwilling to let the information go unacknowledged. "This isn't backyard experimenting," she said quietly, brown eyes catching Ethan's for a second. "Somebody with real training did this, somebody who knew exactly what they were doing." From there, the trail moved outward, shipping records, delivery logs, supply chains that snaked from out-of-state pharmaceutical warehouses to rural clinics, and special orders placed under innocuous names. Detective Liam Hart, the county investigator assigned to coordinate, was in his early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a square face softened by a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow, and an unexpectedly gentle way of asking hard questions. He had the look of a man who had seen more than enough of human nature, but still managed to show up clean-shaven to court out of respect for the process. In the cramped briefing room at Pine Haven's small station, He traced lines across a whiteboard with a marker, connecting order numbers to addresses and names. Ethan watched in silence, arms folded across his chest. Halo's empty kennel, always present in the back of his mind like a missing piece of the board. It took 10 days after Christmas for the trail to narrow from possibilities to a name. The file that landed on the table bore a letterhead most people in the region would have recognized: Hale Regional Veterinary Clinic, a respected practice that sat on the edge of a neighboring town, its sign usually adorned with cheerful silhouettes of pets. The man behind it, Dr. Victor Hale, was a familiar figure at school fairs, charity events, and agricultural shows, a veterinarian who appeared in local news segments about winter pet safety and summer parasite prevention, his public image carved carefully from warmth and reassurance. On paper, he was in his mid-50s, with degrees from reputable universities and a decades-long record of service. In person, when Ethan saw him for the first time through a surveillance photo, he appeared as the kind of man neighbors instinctively trusted. Medium height, lean build beneath well-cut coats, hair silvering at the temples, in a way that suggested distinguished aging rather than fatigue. His face had sharp but kind features, high cheekbones, a firm jaw, and pale blue eyes that cameras often caught with a crinkled, almost fatherly smile. In the photo, he was bent over a golden retriever, one hand resting lightly on the dog's head, the other gesturing as he spoke to a family just outside the frame. It would have been easy, Ethan thought, for most people to believe in that face. Somewhere along the line, many had. What the financial records showed under the surface was different. Unusual purchases of chemical agents masked through intermediary suppliers, specialized cages ordered through industrial catalogs, a rented storage unit near the base of the mountain, under an alias that did not hold up to scrutiny. Cross-checked phone records showed calls pinging near Pine Haven's forest edge, on nights when residents reported missing pets, wildlife sightings that suddenly stopped, and strange, soft howls that never found a source. Piece by piece, the pattern formed something that could no longer be explained away by coincidence. The arrest itself happened on an overcast morning, when the snow had settled into dull, dirty ridges along the roadsides. Ethan was not required to be there, but he requested inclusion in the warrant execution, and the supervising officers granted it with a nod. They found Dr. Hale at a small private airstrip outside town, standing near a single-engine plane with 2 pieces of luggage at his feet. He was dressed in a charcoal wool coat and dark jeans, a scarf looped neatly around his neck, the image of a professional heading to a conference rather than a suspect fleeing a crime. Up close, his age showed more clearly, fine lines at the corners of his eyes, a faint sag around the mouth, but his posture remained erect, his gaze calm. When the officers approached, accompanied by 2 marked patrol units and an unmarked car, Victor Hale did not attempt to run. His pale eyes flicked briefly from the badges to the folded papers in Detective Hart's hand, and then to Ethan, standing slightly behind the others, collar turned up against the wind. For the briefest instant, Hale's gaze sharpened, something like recognition or calculation flickering there, but his expression smoothed almost immediately into confusion. "There must be some mistake," he said, voice low and warm, shaped by years of reassuring clients whose pets trembled on examination tables. "I'm a veterinarian, not a criminal." Hart read the warrant with deliberate clarity, listing the charges: illegal possession of controlled substances, animal cruelty on an aggravated scale, unregistered experimentation, and more. As the words piled one atop another, the mask on Hale's face did not crack so much as a thin. His confusion dimmed, replaced by a cool, distant focus that seemed more genuine than any televised smile. The cuffs clicked around his wrists. For the first time, a flicker of irritation crossed his features, almost delicate in its restraint. He did not protest further as he was led to the car. The interrogation room was a narrow rectangle of neutral color and humming fluorescent light, designed to strip context from conversation and pin truth, or something like it, under scrutiny. Hale sat on one side of the table, his posture immaculate despite the fatigue that had begun to etch shadows beneath his eyes. Without the coat and scarf, he seemed smaller, but not diminished. He wore a simple button-down shirt, sleeves neatly rolled to the mid-forearm, the gesture crisp and controlled. His hair, now clearly more gray than silver, was combed back with precise care, as if he had taken a moment before entering the room to ensure his reflection would not betray him. Ethan sat opposite him, not as lead interrogator, that role belonged to Hart, but as a necessary presence. The animals rescued from the cabin, the evidence collected, and the timeline reconstructed all converged into this room. Hale's attorney had not yet arrived, but he had been advised of his rights and had declined, at least for the moment, to remain silent. "You understand why you're here, Doctor," Hart began, voice level. Hale tilted his head a fraction, blue eyes calm, hands folded on the table. "I understand you're accusing me of something you don't fully comprehend," he replied. "I work with animals. I save lives. I've done so for 30 years. Hart slid photographs across the table. Images of the underground room, the cages, the animals with IV marks and shave patches, the empty bent bars where one prisoner had escaped. The camera had caught everything in cold, unflattering light. For a long moment, Hale said nothing. He studied the photos as if they were test results for a difficult diagnosis, his gaze moving slowly from one to the next. When he finally spoke, his tone had changed. The warmth was gone, replaced by something clinical and faintly annoyed. "They're samples," he said. "Experimental subjects, necessary for advancement. You drag them out halfway through the procedure and then blame me when the data is incomplete." Ethan felt a muscle tighten along his jaw. The word samples landed like a physical blow in his chest. Hart did not react visibly. He asked, "And the dog?" Hale's eyes lifted. "Which dog?" "The white German shepherd," Hart replied. "The one who led our officer to your little project." For the first time, something sharp and ugly flickered across Hale's face. Contempt, thinly veiled. "Ah," he said softly. "The defective one?" The room seemed to constrict around Ethan. His hands curled slowly into fists on his knees beneath the table, knuckles whitening. In his mind, he saw Halo standing in the cold, refusing to sit as each cage door opened, the silent endurance written into every line of his body. Defective. The word scraped against every instinct Ethan carried, against every memory of K9 partners who had died, giving more than any human could ask. Hart's gaze flicked sideways, registering the tension without acknowledging it openly. "Defective how?" he asked. Hale's lips thinned. "Unreliable response profile. Irregular tolerance to compounds, non-compliant under stimulus. A sample that refuses to hold still is useless. It escaped before I could complete the series. That alone should tell you your interference has compromised months of work." The air in the room thickened, humming fluorescent lights suddenly too loud. Ethan's chair scraped faintly as he shifted, leaning forward, words burning at the back of his throat. He imagined, for a heartbeat, the satisfying simplicity of reaching across the table, of wiping that cold detachment from Hale's face with the kind of lesson only pain could teach. But law, like winter, did not care for the heat of impulse. It demanded structure, procedure, signatures, and the slow grinding of a system built, imperfectly, painfully, to stand between rage and retribution. Hart's voice cut through the charged silence. "Dr. Hale, every word you say now is being recorded," he reminded, tone still calm. "You're describing live animals as failed materials. You're admitting to administering unapproved compounds without oversight or consent." Hale gave a small, dismissive shrug. "They're animals," he said. "They don't consent to anything. We decide for them. That's what ownership is." The sentence hung in the air like frost. Ethan's nails bit into his palms through the fabric of his gloves. He could feel his heartbeat in his throat, a steady drum of thunder pressed against ribs already tight from contained fury. Hart saw it and moved forward with the interview, guiding Hale's arrogance into confession. Shipment dates, experimental goals, the quiet network of suppliers who would now find their own doors knocked upon in the early hours of the morning. By the time the session ended, there was no room left for doubt. The recordings, the lab reports, the financial trails, and Hale's own words formed a chain stronger than any single outburst of violence could ever be. As officers led Hale from the room toward a holding cell and, later, formal arraignment, the veterinarian's composure remained intact, but his eyes were no longer warm or pleading. They were flat, distant, calculating in a way that no longer mattered. The machinery of the law had closed around him, heavy and inexorable. Ethan stayed seated for a moment after the door closed, staring at the empty space where Hale had been. His hands slowly unfurled, leaving crescent marks along his palms that ached with returning blood. Rage still burned in him, but it no longer demanded action. The necessary damage had already been done, not by fists, but by facts. Outside, the winter sky over Pine Haven lay low and heavy, but somewhere beyond the clouds, the days were imperceptibly lengthening. In a rehabilitation center not far away, a white dog lay in a clean enclosure, eyes half closed, ears flicking faintly at the sounds of nurses and distant traffic. Whatever had been broken in that underground room was far from healed, but another truth now ran parallel to it. The man who had called him defective would not be the one to write the end of his story. Law had finished what violence might have started, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan found himself willing to let that be enough. The world did not heal all at once. It never did. In the weeks after the storm, after the sirens faded and the blue-red lights vanished back into ordinary darkness, healing arrived in fragments, measured in heartbeats regained, stitches removed, tremors slowly quieted. Halo was kept in a specialized rehabilitation wing just outside Pine Haven, a low, reinforced facility built for animals that had been broken in ways people rarely understood. The building stood at the edge of a thawing forest, where snow melted unevenly into dark veins along the soil, as if the earth itself were learning how to breathe again. Halo's first days there were marked by vigilance rather than rest. He tolerated examination only in short intervals, muscles tensing beneath pale fur whenever unfamiliar hands approached. The veterinarians moved slowly around him, adjusting their techniques to his boundaries rather than forcing compliance. Among them was Dr. Eliza Morin, a behavioral rehabilitation specialist in her early 40s, tall and spare with calm blue eyes, and a voice trained by years of working with traumatized animals. Her brown hair was always tied back loosely at the nape of her neck, a few silver strands escaping no matter how carefully she arranged it. Eliza had built her career around creatures that no longer trusted the world, and she carried herself with the patience of someone who believed that trust, once broken, could still be rebuilt, brick by careful brick. Under her supervision, Halo's physical injuries were treated first. The cuts along his flank were cleaned and stitched, the torn ear repaired with delicate precision. The damaged hind leg was x-rayed and stabilized, with a brace that wrapped snugly around muscle that had learned to endure rather than to rest. But it was the unseen damage that required the most time. Loud noises sent tremors racing through him. Sudden shadows made his breath hitch. When confined without visible exits, his pulse accelerated into shallow panic, a memory echoing back to iron bars and chemical cold. Through it all, he allowed exactly one person near him without hesitation. Ethan. Ethan came at first every day, then every other day, as shifts demanded, always at the same quiet hour when the facility was dim with late afternoon light. He would stand just inside the enclosure door without stepping forward, hands relaxed at his sides, posture open but non-intrusive. He never spoke loudly to Halo. Sometimes he said nothing at all. Sometimes he talked about the weather, about the slow return of town routines, about a grocery store reopening, about snow melting into rivers along the streets. He spoke as if the dog understood words not as commands, but as steady proof that the world outside the cage still existed. Halo listened, at first from a distance, amber eyes tracking Ethan with guarded assessment, then slowly, with the smallest shifts of proximity, one paw closer, then another. On the 7th day, as Ethan finished speaking about nothing important at all, Halo crossed the remaining space and rested his head against Ethan's knee for exactly 3 seconds before withdrawing again. Dr. Morin noted the moment on her tablet without comment, but her hands were trembling when she lowered it. 3 weeks passed in careful increments. The brace was adjusted. The stitches came out. Halo's stride lengthened, uneven at first, then gradually smoothing as muscle remembered how to move without pain. His reactions softened. The night terrors, quiet episodes where his body stiffened in sleep, became shorter, less frequent. He still startled at sudden sound. He still scanned corners before lying down. But now he also played, hesitantly at first, nudging a rope toy with distrust, then shaking it once with surprising ferocity, as if testing whether joy could still be trusted. By the end of the third week, Dr. Morin made her assessment. Halo was not cured. Trauma did not work that way, but he was stable, responsive, capable of forming secure attachment, and, most importantly, he had already chosen his person. Ethan sat across from her in the small consultation office, hands folded around a paper cup of cooling coffee. Snowmelt tapped softly against the window behind her, each drop a faint echo of the storm that had rewritten both their lives. "He will always carry this," Eliza said gently, touching the side of her head. "Certain smells, certain sounds, confinement. He may never be a carefree dog, but he is capable of bond, loyalty, and recovery with the right home." Ethan did not answer at once. He looked down at his hands, the faint scars across his knuckles from years of work, from one avalanche rescue that had ended with Rex buried beneath ice and silence. "You think that could be me?" he said at last. Not as a question, as a weighing of truth. Eliza met his gaze evenly. "He already thinks it is." The first night Halo came home was quiet in a way that made the walls seem to listen. Ethan's house stood near the edge of Pine Haven, a modest one-story structure with weathered siding and a porch that had once held 2 sets of boots. Snow still lingered in pale ridges along the driveway. The porch light glowed warm against gathering dusk as Ethan opened the door and stepped inside, Halo at his side on a loose leash that neither of them fully needed. Inside, the Christmas tree still stood in the corner of the living room, lights dim but glowing, ornaments untouched since the storm. No gifts had ever been placed beneath it this year. On the opposite wall, a framed photograph rested on a simple shelf. Rex, ears perked, tongue lolling in a frozen mid-smile captured on a training field years earlier. The room carried the faint scent of pine, coffee, and old memories that had learned to live without being disturbed. Halo entered slowly, body low, but no longer trembling. He paused just beyond the threshold, eyes sweeping the space, assessing each shadow, each quiet corner. The leash slipped from Ethan's hand and pooled at his feet. He did not urge the dog forward. He simply waited. Halo took one step, then another. He circled the room once, wide and cautious, as if mapping a new territory that promised neither cages nor needles. When he reached the photograph of Rex, he stopped. His head tilted slightly, breath slowing. Ethan watched without moving, heart tightening in a way that was neither grief nor fear, but something that lived painfully between them. "You don't replace anyone," Ethan said softly, voice no more than breath. "You didn't come to fill a space. You came to remind me that I can still keep one." Halo turned back to him. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the quiet room that had been empty in ways walls could not show. Then Halo crossed the space between them and lowered himself to the floor at Ethan's feet, easing down with care as the healing leg bent. He rested his head against Ethan's shin, the weight deliberate, the contact unmistakably chosen. Ethan sat down slowly beside him, back against the couch, one hand resting against the warmth of Halo's neck. The dog released a deep, quiet breath, the kind that came only after a long watch ended. Outside, snow began to fall again. Not the violent spiral of the storm that had torn open the mountain, but a gentler descent, flakes drifting lazily beneath the porch light like slow-moving stars. Pine Haven slept beneath it, unaware of how closely it had once hovered to hidden darkness, how narrowly certain lives had passed from silence back into sound. Inside the small house, there were no sirens now, no radios crackling with urgency, only the soft rhythm of shared breathing, the hum of fading Christmas lights, and the quiet understanding between a man who had learned to close himself off and a dog who had learned how to come back from a place that tried to unmake him. The storm had ended. What followed was not miracle, not erasure of pain, but something far rarer and harder to earn, the long, ordinary work of choosing to trust another day. In the quiet ending of this story, we are reminded that the miracles of God do not always arrive with thunder or bright signs in the sky. Sometimes they come through a wounded soul that refuses to give up, through a tired heart that chooses kindness instead of fear, and through a single act of courage that changes many lives. In our daily lives, we all walk through seasons of loss, loneliness, doubt, and exhaustion. Moments when we feel forgotten beneath the weight of our own storms. But God walks beside us even then, sending help in ways we may not recognize. At first teaching us that no life is beyond rescue and no heart is too broken to be healed. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what you felt and where you are watching from. And if you believe in the gentle miracles God still sends into our lives, please type Amen in the comments. May God bless you and your family with peace, protection, and strength in every season. And please remember to press subscribe to support this channel so we can continue bringing stories of faith, love, and second chances to you.